In the early 1200s, on the plains outside a Chinese fortress, defenders loaded a bronze tube with black powder and a stone ball, aimed it at an advancing army, and lit a fuse. Nobody watching that moment fully understood what they were looking at. They weren't witnessing the debut of a finished weapon. They were watching the middle chapter of a story that had already been unfolding for 3 centuries, and one that still had another 600 years left to run before anything resembling a modern firearm existed. That's the strange truth buried underneath a question that sounds like it should have a clean, single answer. There was no single day humans invented the gun. No lone inventor standing in a workshop with a eureka moment. What there was instead was a long, uneven relay race, passed from alchemists to army engineers to metalworkers to gunsmiths across 3 continents, each one solving a narrow, specific problem left behind by whoever came before them. To understand how the gun actually came into existence, you have to start somewhere that has nothing to do with killing anyone at all. Sometime around the 9th century, Chinese alchemists were searching for an elixir of immortality, blending minerals and following recipes rooted in medicinal and mystical tradition. One combination they landed on mixed sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter, a naturally occurring mineral that happens to be a powerful oxidizer. Heated together, the mixture didn't extend anyone's life. It combusted violently, fast enough to singe eyebrows and occasionally set workshops on fire. They called it huoyao, fire medicine, a name that reveals exactly what they thought they'd made. A failed drug, not a weapon. For roughly a century afterward, this new substance stayed mostly a curiosity. It showed up in fireworks and smoke signals and temple festivals, delighting crowds with noise and color that had nothing to do with combat. If you'd told those alchemists that their ruined batch of medicine would eventually end the reign of armored knights on horseback and reshape the architecture of European castles, they would have had no idea what you were talking about. The shift began once Chinese military officers got a look at what fire medicine could actually do in the hands of someone who wanted to hurt an enemy. Somewhere around the 10th century, someone had the idea of packing gunpowder into a bamboo tube and lashing that tube to the end of a spear. Light the fuse in close combat, and the weapon spat flame directly into whoever was unlucky enough to be standing in front of it. This device, the fire lance, wasn't accurate, wasn't especially deadly in a mechanical sense, and definitely wasn't reusable in any efficient way. But it worked psychologically in a way nothing else on a medieval battlefield could match. Soldiers trained their whole lives to face blades and arrows. Facing an opponent who could project actual fire was a different kind of fear entirely, and Chinese defenders used exactly that kind of weapon to help hold off besieging armies in the 12th century, proving that gunpowder had graduated from novelty to genuine battlefield tool. Someone eventually thought to pack shards of metal and pottery into the tube alongside the powder. Suddenly, the fire lance wasn't just burning people, it was flinging shrapnel at them. That one addition marks the real conceptual turning point. The moment gunpowder weapons stopped being about fire and started being about launching a projectile using expanding gas. Every gun that has ever existed since is at its core a more refined version of that idea. Bamboo, though, has limits. Pack in enough powder to make the projectile fly with real force, and the tube splits apart in your hands. The next leap came when Chinese metalworkers started casting the tube out of bronze instead, strong enough to contain far more violent combustion without disintegrating. That single material change produced the hand cannon, and by the 1200s, metal-barreled gunpowder weapons were a standard part of Chinese arsenals, alongside larger siege devices, with names that translate to things like heaven-shaking thunder, designed to blast apart fortified walls that had never faced anything like them before. It's worth pausing on something easy to miss here. Gunpowder technology didn't move down one single evolutionary line toward the gun. Chinese engineers were also stuffing powder into rocket casings during this same period, launching fire arrows that would eventually spread to Korea and India along an entirely separate branch, one that centuries later resurfaces in military rocketry and, further still, in the earliest space programs. The gun and the rocket share the exact same great-grandparent, born in that same accidental batch of fire medicine. The technology's westward journey has an unlikely delivery driver, the Mongol Empire. When Mongol armies swept through China in the 1200s, they encountered gunpowder weapons directly during sieges where Chinese defenders used exactly these tools to slow their advance. Rather than simply losing to the new technology, the Mongols absorbed it, and once they controlled the largest contiguous land empire history had ever seen, they functioned as an accidental courier service, carrying gunpowder knowledge along their campaigns of conquest into Central Asia and toward the Islamic world far faster than trade caravans alone ever could have. By the late 1200s, the technology had reached Europe. Arriving in a political landscape it was about to dismantle piece by piece. This wasn't an isolated transfer either. Paper, printing, and the magnetic compass were making the same general journey westward during roughly the same stretch of centuries. part of a much larger current of ideas moving from east to west, long before anyone had a word for globalization. Some historians point to just how closely early European cannon designs mirror Chinese ones as evidence that this was direct knowledge transfer, not two civilizations independently stumbling onto identical solutions. Early European hand cannons were crude, a metal tube on a pole loaded from the open end, fired by touching a burning cord to a small hole and hoping for the best. Clumsy as they were, they still did something no sword or arrow ever could. They punched through plate armor. They cracked stone walls that had withstood sieges for generations. The entire military order, built around expensive, heavily armored cavalry, began to wobble because a relatively cheap weapon, in the hands of a far less expensively trained soldier, could now neutralize a knight who'd spent a lifetime and a fortune preparing for combat the traditional way. Castle architecture had to answer back. Tall, thin walls built to repel scaling attackers and arrows became liabilities against cannon fire almost overnight, and military engineers responded with the low-angled, thickly reinforced star forts and bastions built specifically to deflect and absorb artillery rather than simply stand there and take it. The gun still had an enormous problem. Firing one took 2 hands and split-second timing, one to hold the weapon steady, one to apply fire to the touch hole, all while trying to aim at a moving target. The fix arrived in the late 1400s with the matchlock, a curved clamp holding a slow-burning cord that lowered automatically into the priming powder when the trigger was pulled. It sounds like a small mechanical tweak. It was the first trigger-actuated firing device ever applied to a handheld weapon, and it meant a single soldier could aim and fire with real precision for the first time in history. Matchlock arquebuses spread with startling speed through Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, into the Ottoman Janissary Corps, across to Portuguese traders who carried the design to Japan in 1543, where local gunsmiths refined it into the Tanegashima, prized even by European observers for its craftsmanship. China itself eventually reabsorbed an improved version of its own original invention, building matchlock birding guns to fight off the same Mongol descendants whose ancestors had once carried the earlier technology westward. The story loops back on itself. Matchlock muskets grew heavy enough to need a support fork just to aim, and slow enough to reload that musketeers needed pikemen standing guard beside them, while they fumbled with cord and powder. That pairing of pikes and shot came to define European battlefields for well over a century. The matchlock's fatal flaw was the flame itself, useless in rain, visible in the dark, requiring constant tending even when nothing was happening. The wheellock, arriving in the early 1500s, replaced the burning cord with a spinning steel wheel striking against pyrite, letting cavalry carry a weapon loaded and ready without an open flame. It was also expensive and mechanically delicate, which kept it a cavalry luxury rather than an infantry standard. The real breakthrough came around 1610, with the flintlock, generally credited to the French gunsmith Marin Le Bourgeois. A spring-loaded hammer holding a shard of flint struck a steel plate, throwing sparks straight into the priming pan. No flame to keep alive, no wheel to wind, dramatically more reliable in bad weather. Within a few decades, it had become the standard infantry weapon across nearly every major European military, a position it would hold for roughly 2 centuries, through colonial expansion, the Napoleonic Wars, and the American Revolution. Flintlock's arrival lined up with another quiet revolution. The socket bayonet, which clamped around the outside of the barrel, instead of plugging into the muzzle, meaning a soldier could fix a blade to his musket and still fire it. That single change meant armies no longer needed separate pikemen for protection. Every soldier could now function as rifleman and spearman, depending on the moment, simplifying training, simplifying supply lines, and reshaping European infantry tactics from the ground up. An advancing line of soldiers with bayonets fixed often broke enemy morale before a single shot was ever fired. The flintlock's 2-century reign ended in the early 1800s with the percussion cap, a small metal cap holding a chemical compound that ignited the instant a hammer struck it. No powder in an open pan, no flint, no steel, no exposure to weather at all. It rendered matchlock, wheellock, and flintlock alike obsolete within a matter of decades, and it closed out the long chain of ignition experiments that had started with monks chasing eternal life almost 1,000 years earlier. From there, the pace only kept accelerating toward repeating rifles, machined precision, and weapons that would have been unrecognizable to a soldier standing in a pike and shot formation just 2 centuries before. Storing the whole arc out, from a Taoist alchemy lab in 9th century China to a flintlock musket on an 18th century battlefield, and the invention of the gun stops looking like a single event and starts looking like what it actually was, an unbroken chain of accident, adaptation, and migration, carried by people who were almost never trying to build the thing they ended up building. A bamboo tube strapped to a spear, a cast bronze cylinder, a burning cord, then a spinning wheel, then a spark-off flint, then a chemical cap that needed no fire at all. Each step solved one specific practical failure in the version that came right before it. No individual in this story set out to invent the firearm. Alchemists were looking for a way to live forever. Military engineers were looking for a way to survive the next siege. Gunsmiths were looking for a way to keep their powder dry. strung together across 1,000 years. And 3 continents, those small, local acts of problem solving, added up to a technology that would eventually end the age of the armored knight, rewrite the architecture of the castle, and determine the outcome of wars on every inhabited continent on Earth. All of it tracing back to a group of monks in a mountain workshop who almost burned their own beards off, looking for something else entirely.